Jews, leftist Jews, the changing contours of a political problem. Published in 1973. The essays by Jean Amery. In a past whose end was marked brusquely by the year 1967, the matter seemed fairly simple. Leftists and Jews, for all that many of the latter were conservative, and in a strict sociological sense stood on the, quote, right, end quote, had an unspoken mutual understanding. Both were minorities, both belonged to the, quote, damned of the earth, end quote. A certain mild anti-Semitic tradition on the left notwithstanding, notably in France, for in that country the name Rothschild is the cipher for capitalism. The socially and politically disenfranchised, on the one hand, and those excluded on religious and racial grounds on the other, generally felt a sense of mutual solidarity. Not only were the left wing, social democratic and communist political parties frequently, quote, managed, end quote, by Jews, a sizable proportion of their grassroots supporters too tended to be Jewish. In his heart of hearts, even the most conservative Jew found it difficult to muster genuine resentment against the left, since only left-wing groups and organizations rejected anti-Semitism on principle. Leftists were interested only in man, not in Germans, Frenchmen, or Englishmen, etc. To the extent that the Jews felt recognized as human beings, they were confident that they could now be Germans, French, or Englishmen too. Left-wing humanism, with its disregard for ethnic, national, or religious distinctions, promised not only universal human equality, but also equality for the Jews within the nation-state. The affinity between the left and the Jews in turn sprang not only from the fact that a significant number of left-wing theoreticians, from Marx, Bernstein, and Max Adler to Adorno and Marcuse, were of Jewish extraction, but also from an instinctual sense that even among conservative Jews it had no fanatical foes. This is now all in the deepest prehistorical past. Where do we stand today? For the leftists, the situation seems to be pretty straightforward. Perhaps I can illustrate the current position with an episode I witnessed. I attended a discussion among the mostly leftist and far-left editors of the radio station of a small Western European country. It concerned Palestinian acts of terror. After several of the rather young members of the editorial team had condoned them with barely concealed enthusiasm, pointing to the legitimacy of the, quote, counter-violence, end quote, deployed by the Palestinians, one young woman dared to raise a rather reticent objection. It was inappropriate, she suggested, simply to justify any and every kind of atrocity with the concept of counter-violence. Instead, one ought to determine on a case-by-case basis whether one could, in any given instance, speak in good faith of counter-violence, or conversely, counter-violence ran the risk of becoming violence per se and thus inhumane. An embarrassing and oppressive silence ensued until one of her interlocutors finally said, quote, I think you are incapable of understanding the conduct of the Palestinians. After all, your late husband was a Jew, end quote. And thus the issue was turned into a matter of kinship liability. The young woman did not say another word, and I, being all the more pars in causa, most certainly did not get involved. Party to the case is the translation of that. Clearly, then, we have reached the point at which leftists no longer accept the word of a Jew, or as one used to say, of a Jew's associate. when the problem of Israel is concerned because it automatically counts as prejudice. Yet one might ask, what does the Jewish problem supposedly have to do with Israel? And are there no significant personalities on the new left who, when it comes to the Middle East, are in complete agreement with the notions of their non-Jewish comrades? Do Ernest Mandel, Eric Fried, Elaine Geismar, or Elaine Krivina not exist? Footnote. The child of Polish-Jewish immigrants, the Belgian Ernest Mandel, 1923 to 1995, was a leading Trotskyite theoretician and played a prominent role in the Fourth International. Of Austrian Jewish parentage, the poet Erich Fried, 1921 to 1988, fled Austria after the Anschluss and stayed in Britain for the rest of his life, but played an active role in West Germany's cultural life. Elaine Geismar, born 1939, is a physicist and activist who played a leading role in the protests in Paris in May 1968, as did the Trotskyite politician Elaine Krivine, born 1941. End footnote. Admittedly, though, they are, and of this I am fairly certain, no more characteristic of the general state of affairs than those Jews who collaborate with the Arab secret services or resistance organizations are of the domestic situation in Israel. For the simple fact of the matter is that an existential bond, in the past one would have said a, quote, bond of fate, end quote, which is actually not a bad epithet, connects the vast majority of Jews the world over to the state of Israel. It goes without saying that this bond has very little to do with unconditional support for everything the respective incumbent Israeli government does. I myself, for example, find the stubborn implacability with which Israel insists on its ownership of the old city of Jerusalem bewildering. Indeed, as a theological, if not theocratic form of obsession, it makes me profoundly uncomfortable. I believe, and am hardly alone in doing so, that the various governments of the state of Israel have committed grave sins of omission by not developing a thought-out, humane, and progressive policy in relation to the Arabs when it was still possible. Neither do I agree with every repressive Israeli measure, nor do I consider it a healthy state of affairs that the Israelis are turning themselves into a, quote, master race, end quote, by importing Arab guest workers to support their economic and industrial expansion. To be sure, these workers are better off in material terms than they ever were back home and under their traditional leaders, but their circumstances are nevertheless disgraceful. These sorts of issues weigh on my leftist conscience, and I would like to see them resolved as soon as possible. And yet, I know that I have a deeply rooted interest in this country, even though I do not know it, do not speak its language, do not subscribe to its religion, and its folklore is as alien to me as that of some African tribe. This interest in Israel, which is shared by all Jews, is by no means irrational. Far from it. It can be readily accounted for in an entirely rational manner. The existence of the state of Israel has bestowed a new identity on every single Jew, even if he feels in no way shaped by his Jewishness. Since Israel exists, he knows that, contrary to the claims that the anti-Semite impressed on him for so long, that he actually began to believe him, he is not cowardly, incapable of manual labor, suited only to the money trade, incapable of working the land, a driveling stay-at-home, and at best a wisecracking chatterer. What is more, he knows that whenever and wherever his life might be in danger, there is a place on earth that would take him in no matter what. He knows that as long as Israel exists, one will not be able to stick him into a fiery furnace again, with the tacit support of the inhospitable host peoples, or accompanied by their non-committal pity at best. He most certainly is, quote, biased, end quote, then, where Israel is concerned. But does that render him completely deluded and necessarily unable to discuss the issue of Israel sensibly and with approximate objectivity? Is he invariably less discerning than his former friends on the left, those comrades who see nothing but the myth of the national resistance struggle, and who show empathy for a deranged book-burning Islamist fanatic of a dictator, but not in the face of the mortal danger faced by every single Israeli? A Jew, and all the more so a traditional leftist Jew, is his connection to Israel notwithstanding, perfectly capable of discussing these issues with considerable reason and without succumbing to an undue emotional strain. The highly strung emotionalization of the issue, it seems to me, as things stand, largely a preserve of the new left. For Israel is nothing but an outpost of American imperialism, and it operates as though General Dayan, I don't know how to say that guy's name, General Dayan, that's what it looks like, so that's how I'm going to pronounce it, had personally ordered the razing of North Vietnamese towns, as though Israel were jointly responsible for every inhumane act committed by the American superpower in Latin America. The truth is surely far removed from this Manichaean notion. One might, if one so wishes, concede that the settlement of homeless Jews in Palestine was a grave historical injustice, a perfectly sinister and dastardly ruse of history. I have no opinion on this. All I know, as does anyone who has ever studied history, is that there are few states on this earth that do not owe their existence to some injustice. Today, one can proceed only from the fact that the enormous efforts of endangered human beings have created Israel, and that the destruction of this country, to which the Arab states aspire, whether they admit it or not, would create an inordinately more horrific injustice. As a Palestinian leader recently explained in an interview with Le Monde, quote, Israel is condemned to win every battle. If it loses just one, then, quote, the then ends with a ... end quote. He did not continue, but everyone knows that he was thinking of the angel of death, who in the event would descend on the country. Israel, then, is fighting her own national liberation struggle against the Arab world, against a foe who is inordinately richer in terms of his population, money, and oil, and thus potentially more powerful. This struggle is at least as legitimate as that of the Palestinians. To the extent that the concept makes any sense, the force Israel exerts is itself a form of counter-violence. It is Israel's historical misfortune that she has only one ally in this liberation struggle, the United States. Israel did not have several options and chose this one. She simply grabbed the only hand that was stretched out in her direction and offering support. Can one seriously expect someone who is drowning to check whether there might be a bloodstain on the rescuing hand before seizing it? That's a good-ass metaphor. This guy's a fucking writer. All this is straightforward to the point of banality. One writes it down with the mild ease of somebody who is uncomfortable because all he can submit are self-evident truths. That it needs to be said all the same reflects no simple-mindedness on the part of the person saying it, but rather the blindness to historical and humanitarian concerns displayed by a left that, in an unhealthy frenzy, has for years publicly denigrated and ultimately disavowed its noblest traditions. It seems to me that in the conflict between the left and the Jews, it is the responsibility of the leftist Jews, who continue stubbornly to maintain their political identity, to confront former comrades with a few elementary truths. Truths that those former comrades will ultimately have to acknowledge, assuming they have not lost their grip on reality altogether. Let me summarize in a few sentences what I mean. Bullet point. Not every bomb thrown, not every hostage killed is per se an act of superior political insight or a sign of heroism. Bullet point. Even when she sticks with the United States as the only ally on offer, Israel does not share the responsibility for all the political and military deeds and misdeeds of that ally. Bullet point. Not every third world regime that calls itself revolutionary actually pursues genuine social revolutionary policies. Algeria, which expelled the Black Panthers, is no more a revolutionary state than Gaddafi's Libya, with its paroxysms of Islamic fanaticism. Bullet point. Anyone who questions Israel's right to exist is either too stupid to understand that he is contributing to, or is intentionally promoting an Uber Auschwitz.